Welcome everybody. It's great to have you all here tonight and welcome to ImpactChat. I'm really thrilled to welcome you here. ImpactChat is a fortnightly series bringing you real people and real conversations. My name's Kathy and I've got the privilege of being the president of Impact. What we do is make a difference to Victorian women and children fleeing extreme violence at home. While we may be a charity, we don't give charity. What we do is give gifts and services and hope with dignity, and we give dignity with gifts, services and hope. If you're able to, please consider giving a tax-deductible donation, which we'll be directing to our court childcare program, a free service for families who need that service while they are in court. I'm currently sitting in my home, which is on the land of the Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. Wherever you are, either in the same lands as I am or on one of the many other traditional lands, on behalf of us all, I acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the first peoples of Australia, the traditional owners of the lands and waters throughout Australia, lands and waters that we're privileged to live on, work and play, lands and waters which have never been ceded. I recognise their people's continuing connection to land, waters and community, and I pay our communal respects to their peoples, their cultures, their languages, and to their elders past, present and future. The beautiful artwork behind me was created by Rachel Sara, an Indigenous artist who originates from the Bunda people in the Goreng country in Queensland. The design has been adopted by the Queensland Government to represent their family violence strategies with special focus on our First Peoples needs, reflecting the needs of equal partners, regardless of race, nationality or culture, joining together in conversation and positive action. And so I think that aptly represents Impact too. The design represents a clear and focused pathway that began as a dispersed energy of many that fuses into channel clarity, momentum and strength. It shows the power of unity and simplicity that can and must evolve from complexity. The hands depict the journey of a child, connected to and supported by structures that nurture and guide. And the woven orange line acknowledges culture, family, and the strength of learning from the past to act in the present and to grow in the future. The design, I think, aptly illustrates Impact's aims and objectives. I want to remind you that we're recording this session. We've had a glitch with going live on Facebook, but we will be posting this recording onto Facebook and on our webpage in case you want to revisit the session again or to encourage anyone who wasn't able to be here tonight to view it at a later date. I encourage you to post your questions in the chat box so that Pat can include them in his conversation with Mark. And so I'm going to hand over to Dr. Patrick Stokes, who will introduce and host tonight's chat with Mark Balla, aka the Toilet Man and host of the Smallest Room podcast. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kathy. Delighted to be here this evening and to be able to support Impact. And really interested and excited to be speaking tonight to Mark Balla, who has a really interesting story to tell. And I'm sure you'll find this story equally interesting. As Kathy just said, just before we go on, you'll notice that there's a little chat function down the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you had any questions you wanted to put to Mark this evening, can you please just type that into that little field there? And as we go through, I'll pick those out and I'll throw that to Mark for you. So Mark finished his linguistics degree and took what I reckon many of us would consider to be probably the coolest job in the world, namely a Lonely Planet travel writer, writing those books that got many of us more or less unscathed through our first overseas trips as young adults. And then went on to a business career in the commercial shipbuilding and then manufacturing industry. And it was in that context that Mark ended up on a trip to India in, I think, 2012, Mark, is that right? Which proved to be life-changing for Mark, but also subsequently life-changing for a great many other people throughout India. So, Mark, welcome. Tell us what happened in India.
Thanks, Patrick. Nice to see you. And just before I do, I just want to say, Kathy, thanks for organising this, and also the work that you do with Impact is just sensational. One of the reasons I accepted your invitation, because I just love what you're doing and the importance of it. So keep up the good work.
Thanks, Mark.
So I had a business manufacturing CDs and DVDs when that was still a good idea. And fortunately, I sold the business when it was still a good idea. So as you do when you sell a business, you often end up with what they call golden handcuffs. So I was tied to the company that bought us out for about 3 years. And at about the time they bought us out, they started up a business in India manufacturing DVDs for the Bollywood market. And they asked me to join the board. I guess they knew my travel background through Lonely Planet and figured, oh, I must be culturally more astute than they were, because they weren't very culturally astute. And so they got me going over to India 3 or 4 times a year for board meetings. And one of the board meetings, I was there a day or so early, and the factory was in Calcutta, but the board used to meet in Mumbai. And I had a bit of time to spare on this particular trip, so I hopped on a train to go into the centre of Mumbai for a look around. And while I was on the train, a couple of young guys came up to me and asked me where I was from. And I told them I was Australian, and they were very excited. We started talking about cricket, of course. That's the first thing that Indians and Australians have in common. And we all know the names of Ganguly and Tendulkar, just like they knew the names of Shane Warne and Ricky Ponting. And so that kept us going for a few minutes. And then I found out that they were students at the University of Mumbai, and they lived in a part of Mumbai called Dharavi. Dharavi has actually been in the news a little bit recently. It's a slum. It's the best description. It's one of the largest slums in Asia. It's certainly the biggest in India. It's about 1 million people living in an area. I'm assuming most, if not all of you, from Melbourne. It's about twice the size of Albert Park Lake. So let's say a couple of square kilometres with 1 million people living in it. And they invited me to visit. And when they told me they were students at the university, I thought, that's great. You'll be able to leave the slum when you finish your studies. And I said, we don't want to leave. It's our home. And so I was quite intrigued by that, and a bit nervous about accepting an invitation, because slums don't necessarily have a great reputation as being all that safe for foreigners. But I figured, so long as they didn't want my kidneys, I'd be right. And I'm very happy to say I've still got both my kidneys. And my decision to visit Dharavi with these 2 guys is ultimately the reason why I'm talking to you all here this evening. So the next morning, after I'd met them before Dharavi with them, and we wandered around for a couple of hours. We looked at where people lived and worked, and where they shopped and where they played and so on. And right at the end, they took me into a school. And I was looking around the school, and there were lots of little boys and little girls, and there were lots of teenage boys. There were no teenage girls. And I asked them, why not? Where are the teenage girls? And they said, well, they've all dropped out because the school has no toilets. Now, as a man from a Western country, I'm not sure I completely got the reason right away. I'm guessing that the women listening here probably understand right away that for girls to go to school where there's no toilet is quite problematic, particularly once they reach adolescence. It just became too difficult, so they just dropped out. And I started wanting to learn more about it, and did a lot of reading. Started with Google, and then started looking for other people who knew more about this stuff. And I guess that's where it started. So do you want me to keep going, Patrick, or do you want to?
Please.
Okay, so it was about 3 months later, I came across a guy in Singapore, a guy called Jack Sim, who was actually the founder of the WTO, which is the World Toilet Organization in Jack's case. Jack's very quick to point out it's just as shitty an organization as the better known WTO. But Jack and I started communicating a little bit just by email, and turned out he was hosting a World Toilet Summit in Indonesia. And there really is such a thing as a World Toilet Summit. So I figured I'd better go along, and flew up there with a friend who'd taken a passing interest in my stories from India about people living without toilets. And we spent 3 days at this summit, and I came back to Australia, and I knew from then that my life was going to be in the toilet until I am no longer here. I got together with some friends, and we set up a little charity called We Can't Wait, with a very bold goal of making sure that everyone on the planet had sustainable sanitation. And I'll admit we haven't quite achieved it yet, but we've made a few inroads with some of the more vulnerable people that we've been working with. So I guess that's the beginning of the story.
It's incredible. So what is it? How then do you make that transition from, okay, you've seen a real problem, and it's a problem that is so sort of basic and ingrained that it's going to take a big sort of systemic change to try and fix that. But it's also, to be really blunt, not a sexy problem. It's not a problem that, is really, televisual. It's not a problem that, has an obvious sort of marketing campaign to it, although you've got no shortage of toilet puns. We've already seen that. But how then do you make that transition to getting people on board with a project like that?
I think the first part of it for me actually was in the timing, that I was at a time in my life where I could actually become engaged in something like this, because it's not necessarily easy if you're younger with a young family and a mortgage and so on. I'd sold my business, so I had a bit of security behind me, so I could sort of say, okay, put other stuff aside, what's really important. My daughter was about 13 at the time. She was going through what girls go through at that age, growing into a young woman and dealing with having her first period and all that kind of stuff. And I was struck by how different her life would be if she was born in this slum in India rather than here in Australia. And I found it unacceptable. When I first started sort of thinking about what can I do, I started talking at a few schools, and I actually spoke at my daughter's school and told this story. And it was the first time I'd ever done any public speaking. I was terrified, and it was very raw, and I hadn't worked out the puns and the jokes and how to make the story flow. I was just in there telling them what I'd seen, and I was quite distressed while I was telling it. But at the end, the headmistress came to me and said, the feedback from the girls was amazing, but the thing that struck them most was that a man who wasn't their doctor or their biology teacher said period in a room full of teenage girls. And I realized that, yeah, that's a subject that actually, certainly in my generation, men and women didn't really talk about much together. And certainly men didn't talk about it to adolescent girls, unless it was their doctor or their biology teacher, maybe their father. But I just realized, it's too important. I need to get over my discomfort about talking about menstruation and just recognize that it's something that 50% of the planet experience in their lives, and something that without it, none of us would be here. And it's something that was causing these young girls and women in India and many other parts of the developing world, was causing them terrible, terrible problems throughout their lives, simply because their societies were not providing any facilities whatsoever for them to deal with their personal needs. So then the transition from talking about it to deciding to do something about it, it came down to I could not stop talking about it. Everywhere I went, I wanted to talk about it. And the thing that amazed me most is that people didn't run away. It wasn't, oh, here comes Mark, he's going to talk about toilets again. It was, oh, tell us the next bit. And so people kept wanting to hear this story. And I just realized that, it gave me real joy and a sense of purpose to start talking about it. But one day a friend of mine said to me, it's great to talk about it, but rather than just talk shit, how about we do something about it? And so that's where the evolution to the charity We Can't Wait came from. The next thing, I was back in India a few months later on another visit to a board meeting, and we were having problems with the unions in a factory, and I'd been directed to a guy over there who had experience dealing with unions, and told I should sit down with him. So we sat down for a business meeting, and you go to a business meeting, the first thing, bit of small talk before you get down to the nuts and bolts of the business meeting. And I remember saying to him, can you believe in your country there are there are some schools that don't have toilets. And he said, yeah, I know about that. In fact, my Rotary Club has a relationship with a school that needs toilets.
Mm-hmm.
And I was pleased to hear it. I was also surprised. I thought Rotary was old men cooking sausages outside Bunnings, and also an organisation that puts signs in the middle of roundabouts in country towns and always bigger than and in front of the Lions side. I had no idea what Rotary was about, and it was a revelation to me that there might be some connection with toilets. And then at this stage, my charity, we'd raised a couple of $1,000 from some school presentations. Didn't really know what to do with it. And this guy at the meeting, he said, why don't you go back to Australia, tell your story to a Rotary Club back there and see if they want to give you some money, and then together we can build some toilets. And that's what I did. And I happened to walk into a club that had a very, very slick membership director, and he had me signed up pretty quick smart. And a few months later, we were building our first toilets. So
I was going to say, so Rotary is an organisation, obviously does a lot of really fantastic work in sort of development space. And we were chatting earlier about, for instance, some of the work they do with vaccinations, and particularly around polio, and eradication of polio. What's the reaction though when you go into an environment like that and say, toilets, guys, we need to think about toilets?
So you mentioned before, toilets aren't very sexy, and certainly if you're working in the space I'm in, which is sanitation. Sanitation is part of a bigger focus area called WASH, water, sanitation and hygiene. If you're talking water, clean water, it's pretty sexy. It looks nice, it tastes nice, smells nice, or has no smell at all. Toilets don't have any of that. And in fact, some of the photos that I show in my talks, I choose not to show them just before people eat, because they can be really quite confronting. But people are interested to hear it. I mean, you've got to remember that in Rotary circles, you're dealing with people who, by the fact that they've chosen to become Rotarians, means that they have an interest in improving the lives of people in need. And when they discover that there's this most basic need, something that we can't imagine. How could you build a school without toilets? When you put the foundations in, don't you put the pipes into the foundations? Whereas over there, that was not how it was done. And so when people here in the West in general hear about it, the first response is, that can't be right. But the second response, and the one that leads them to decide they want to get involved, is when they hear about the impact on the lives of girls and women in particular, men and boys too. I mean, this affects everyone. The alternative to using a toilet is open defecation. If you don't like that term, that means shitting outside. So I think when you look at communities where open defecation is the norm, the first thing you find is stunted growth among the kids who are alive, high child mortality among under fives. I went to a community in Cambodia where nearly 10% of the kids died before the age of 5, simply because there were no toilets, no clean water. And it was a flood prone area, so they'd dig a hole, they'd go to the toilet in the hole, the wet season had come, and suddenly they'd be up to their waists in it. This is how so many hundreds of millions of people live in the developing world. And as Australians, a lot of us have travelled in the developing world. And I remember when I was starting to learn about this, sort of thinking, surely I must have seen this before. And I suddenly realised I had. I've been on trains in the developing world, looked out the window, seen someone going to the toilets in the field, but not put two and two together. They're going into the toilet in the field because there's no alternative. And it's not just one person, it's the entire population of that village. And the impact, of course, is that, if one person in the village has a toilet but the rest don't, the flies land on the shit that's spread around near, and then they land on people's food and in their water. Everyone gets sick. Only a toilet for some of the people isn't the solution. Everyone needs to be using toilets, not defecating in the open, before the health risk to the children in particular, before that is mitigated, before it's got rid of.
So Mark, walk us through the process of what you do when you've identified where you can make a difference here. How do you actually then go about affecting that sort of change? What do you have to do on the ground in terms of working with schools, with governments, with other sort of local stakeholders? What actually happens practically?
So look, when we started, there's this school I've been told about. It's got 500 kids. They need 15 toilets. We're just going to go and do it. Fantastic. And the project worked out all right. It's not our best project. It was our first. We've learned a lot from it. The first thing we learned is don't just go and build toilets because you think they need them. You actually need to talk to the people about what they need and what they want. That community engagement in any development project is just crucial. Without wanting to get into politics, one of the reasons that we've got some people fighting about what's going on against what's happening in our community at the moment is that maybe there wasn't enough community engagement for some of them. And the reality is community engagement is the first thing you need to get people to come along on the journey with you in any journey, whether it's in the West, whether it's in the developing world. So after we'd gone through our first project, we then started saying, okay, how can we make sure that our projects continue to get better every time? And we started a process where we would actually make it competitive. So our second project, we worked with 7 schools, about 5,000 children. There were about 30 schools in the area in need. We couldn't help them all. We didn't have enough money to help them all. So we told them all, we're in town. We want to build toilets for anyone who wants them. And we want to provide education about hand washing. And we want to help you come up with a way of sourcing soap or making your own soap. And we want to help you improve your lives through this process. Who wants it? And of the 30, 25 wanted it. And then we went through a process of whittling them down. And there were some basic requirements for us. There had to be enough water. If there wasn't enough water, we give it to Engineers Without Borders or World Vision. They do great work in more difficult environments. I don't want that stuff. I'm looking for low-hanging fruit with a high likelihood of a successful outcome. And once we know the waters, then we've got to make sure there's enough space for the number of toilets they need. We've got to make sure that the headmaster and the school board are just about on their knees begging for help. We've got to make sure that the parents of the children are also saying, why haven't our schools got toilets? We want it. Children have to be, everyone's got to be involved and want it. And that got us down to about 11. And then we just started sort of whittling further and further. You know, who is in a position to say to the parents, you need to put in X number of rupees per month or per year to help ensure that we have soap. Or parents would say, yes, we'll do the cleaning. You know, so because cleaning and maintenance are critical components of it. So we're looking for people who are absolutely ready for it. So our selection process is actually reject rather than accept.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, because that was one question I wanted to ask too, of course, is that there's notoriously a problem that when you do big infrastructure type projects for communities that need them, the infrastructure then needs to be maintained. And of course, that means there has to be the resources locally to be able to maintain that. How do you ensure that going forward, you're actually going to have that kind of buy-in?
Well, look, it's probably fortunate that we started with India. India is a country that is well resourced. We're not working in extreme remote communities. We're working in sort of communities that are within, say, 50 to 70 kilometres of a medium-sized residential area. So they've got access to hardware and they've got access to tradespeople and so on. We have actually looked at, and we're starting a project in Ethiopia now, which is, I'll talk about a bit later. That is far more complicated. But I guess, the first thing was, as part of that selection process, make sure they've got access to what they need to do the maintenance and cleaning. We also engage with the local government through our partners over there. The local government has to agree that they will empty the septic tanks, because we're using septic tanks in most cases, not sewers. They don't have sewer systems in the places we're working in generally. We've looked at greener technologies, composting and so on, but in fact, our aim is not to put in toilets. Our aim is to help girls stay in school longer. And the toilets are the method that we have to take away one of the barriers to staying in school. And in the long term, we're hoping that some of these communities will decide that they want to go greener themselves, but this is not about being green. This is about education. And in fact, the green bit comes later. That's the next generation that decides to be green. You know? So educating girls is, I think it's the greatest opportunity we've got on the planet to make the planet a better place. And yeah, so.
It also seems to give you a goal that's got a nice clear metric on it too. You know, so are you able to sort of quantify? I mean, I know it hasn't been going that long in the grand scheme of things, but are you able to quantify what sort of impact it's already had?
We are. We've in fact, the first project we did where we built the toilets in that first school that I've been spoken to about, we put 15 toilets in the school of 500 kids, and then I went down to the south of India just to sit on the beach and write a paper for a conference that I was invited to speak at. And I had a call from the headmaster just 3 days after we'd opened the toilets. He says, "Mark, we've got a problem." And I thought, hackles up on the back of my neck. I don't want problems, I want good news. He said, "What?" I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "The boys are complaining." And we built toilets for the boys too. So I couldn't imagine what they were complaining about. He said, "Yeah, they're complaining because the queue for drinking water got longer." 3 days. We saw real evidence of something dramatic changing in the lives of these girls. Wow. 3 days after opening these toilets. And it hadn't crossed my mind that one of the things for girls is they won't drink water if there's not a toilet that they can reach. And in fact, I know a lot of women who in the West who've told me if they're traveling in the developing world and they know toilets are going to be hard to find, they think twice before they drink. And in fact, I think I've even heard someone say, if I go to the football or to the theatre, I think twice before I drink, because the bloody queues. You know, this is not just a developing world thing, but the impact is so much worse.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. Just
that was the first time we saw something, this instant impact. Probably my favourite story of impact was tiny little school a friend took me to in a village of 300 people. This is before I'd heard about Rotary. It was after I'd been to the slum. Village had 300 people. There was one little primary school with 25 kids in it, all primary age. And then one teacher, a young woman about 25 years old. And she showed us around this school. It was one room. And she showed us around and we worked out pretty quickly, there's no toilet here. And so I asked her how she managed, and she said, "Well, I live in another village about 2 hours away by bus, and I take the bus to work every day. I work all day, then I take the bus home. And when I get home, the first thing I do is have a big drink of water." So in fact, that same message about water. Wasn't drinking it during the day because she was afraid she might need to go to the toilet. So I asked her how she managed when she had her period. And she said that the children didn't go to school on those days. So a young woman's period was affecting pre-adolescent children and their education.
Wow.
So the children's education was being curtailed every time she had a period. The mothers of these children, who were all day wage earners, so I don't know, they weren't paid if they didn't go to work. They had to stay home to look after their kids on the days that this young woman had her period. And the whole community knew every time she had a period. So her dignity was being smashed. And the whole community was paying the price. And I said to this guy, I was floored by what I'd heard. This was all new to me. I said to him, "I can't leave this place without doing something about it." And he agreed. And he was in the world of sanitation. And he took me to this place because he knew that I was interested. And he said, "Look, we can do something here with one toilet and one wash basin. It's only primary kids and it's one young woman as a teacher. In a perfect world, you want separate boys and girls toilets, but we're not looking for perfect. We're looking for some kind of solution." And so he said, "We can do it for about $700 US. Can you pay for half of it, Mark?" And I said, "Sure." So I gave him half of my pocket. And he called me up about 3 months later. I was back in Australia. He called me up and he said, "Mark, I've got a message for you from the teacher. She wants you to know that the first thing she does when she gets to school now is have a big drink of water." That was my aha moment with this thing.
Yeah,
that was the moment where I said, this has got me absolutely hook, line and sinker. She also wanted me to know that the previous month was the first time that she'd gone to work every day, which meant the kids' education was back on track. Mums were able to work every day, so family incomes were back up. And nobody knew when she had her period. She had her privacy back. And $700 in the lives of 300 people changed, bang. Plus her family, of course, back home. So this was just a massive revelation for me. I still feel emotional when I tell that story. It's one of the most profound moments of my life, without a doubt. I got lucky. I was in the right place at the right time, and the right person for it. So many people go through life never finding that cause that will drive them 24 hours a day if necessary. Kathy's obviously found it, and I found it in the toilet. Go figure.
So we've had a question from the floor, and I'll just remind everyone too, if you have questions for Mark, please feel free to just pop them into the chat box and I'll pass those along. Alex was wondering, it's a two-part question. In India as well, is this not just a problem in schools, but as well, or other places as well? And also she's wondering if there are similar analogues to this in remote Indigenous communities in Australia. Is similar sort of work going on there?
Good question. So the first part, my timing in India was exceptional. It was not long before Mr. Modi became the boss in India. And I don't know much about his politics. I'm told he's probably a bit more right-wing than I like, but he was very interested in sanitation. That made me like him regardless of the rest of his policies. He liked the toilet, that worked for me. And he looked at the situation in India. There were 100 million homes in India with no toilet at that time. With about 800 million Indians defecating in the open. And he decided to do something about it and started a program called Swachh Bharat, which means Clean India. And through the Swachh Bharat program, which is imperfect, but through that program, the Indian government started a social movement to make sanitation something that people wanted to talk about and wanted to bring into their lives, something to be proud of and all that. And in the last 5 years, through this program, 94 million household toilets have been built in India, the biggest sanitation program in human history. As a result of it, there've been movies made, one called A Toilet, A Love Story, or in Hindi it's Toilet Ek Prem Katha. Great story, and one of the side stories in that is connected with something that really did happen in India, where there's this movement of young women who are saying, no loo, no I do. So they won't marry the guy until he's got a toilet available for them. And this became a thing in India too. And then the next part was this guy down in the south of India. I'm guessing Chana is of subcontinent heritage. No, sorry, I'm just guessing. I've got it wrong. But anyway, this guy in the south of India, whose name I absolutely can't pronounce. The South Indian names are long. He saw his wife hiding something behind her back one day, and she wouldn't show him, and he kept on pushing, and finally she showed him a bloody rag. He said, what have you done? And she very embarrassed, explained, well, I had my period, and I used this rag to deal with it. And he didn't know what periods were. He didn't know what the blood was about. So she explained it to him, and then he got some doctors to explain it to him. And he said, why are you using rags? Surely there's got to be a better way to do it. And she took him to the shop and showed him the commercially available product. And he looked at it, how can people afford that? I mean, these people were earning nothing. And so he said, I'm going to find a cheaper way to make this. And he started experimenting with cotton, with wood fibers, all kinds of different things. And he, to find out if they worked, he took his different samples to the local university and offered them to young female students free of charge if they'd give them to him after they'd used them. That was really quite gross. So he started doing that, and his wife came home one day and walked out, and he's in the sort of back yard of his house with all these used pads. And she left him on the spot. She said, you pervert. And she walked out on him. Took her mother with her as well. They've moved back with him since, because he went on, and he went on. He actually became, a couple of years later, he was in the top 100 most influential people according to Time magazine. There was a documentary made about him called The Menstrual Man. He's done a TED talk. which is really hard to understand because his accent's so strong. And then more recently, they made a movie about him called The Padman. And just an absolute hero, this guy. And he ended up making some low-cost machinery, which has been sold at cost around small communities all over India, where groups of women now get together and they're able to make their own pads like a cottage industry, sell them for 2 or 3 cents per pad rather than 20 or 30 or 40 cents a pad that they were having to buy them for commercially previously. And so he's empowered these women to take control of their finances and also to take control of their personal hygiene. And this is spread like wildfire around India. And so now people talk about menstruation, people talk about toilets, people talk about open defecation, and it's a slow burn, but India's changed. In the years I've been going, it's changed in this regard.
So have you. I think it's pretty clear there's been a big shift in your life. So, you know, 12 years ago, I mean, you've done a TED Talk yourself. You've done.
Yep.
There's a book. There's the podcast. I mean, so you know,
And Kathy, it's Toilet Warrior, not Toilet Man. I like that one better.
How did the book come about? What was the story there?
So the name Toilet Warrior came from an Indian community magazine here in Melbourne that heard what we were doing and decided to write a story about it. And when they were interviewing me, I told them about Jack Sim, the founder of the WTO, who's known as Mr. Toilet, and about another guy in India I know who's known as the Poop Guy. And so they decided to give me a name so I could stand alongside these guys, so Toilet Warrior. And on the cover, the little finger, in India, that means I need to go to the toilet. And the book, I'd been talking about writing it for a while. It's my TED Talk was 15 minutes. This is 250 pages, so it's a major extension of the TED Talk. It came down to my daughter took me aside in October a couple of years ago and said, stop talking about it and do it. And she said, November is something called NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month. Why don't you try and write it in November? And so I wrote it in November. It took me 30 days to write it. And, I was probably cheating because it's not a novel, but I guess you'd call it creative nonfiction. But,
no, that's right.
I'm happy to stand by it. It was good. I got through it in a month. I wouldn't have done it otherwise. So I didn't have a target and my daughter breathing down my neck.
And then the podcast as well, which is an interesting sort of development.
So the podcast, it's interesting as well. So what happened with the book? When I first wrote it, I thought I'm going to sell 100,000 copies. Of course, I didn't realize. I probably knew that being a fairly niche subject in non-fiction, it's unlikely to sell 100,000. I've sold 2,000. After I sold the first copy, I put the $25 in my top pocket, and I was walking back to my car, and I thought, oh, I don't think I can keep this money. It doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the people it's about. It belongs to the Rotary Foundation that's helped us fund our projects. And so in the end, I've given most of the profits from the sales of these books straight to the projects. But as sales started to dry up, I started looking, well, so how do I increase sales? And someone said, why don't you start a podcast? That's one way a cross-promotional tool. And it may or may not work. I've sold a couple of extra through the podcast, but I don't think it matters that much. If I do, I'm really happy because it'd be nice to sell some more. I want more people to know the story. But through the podcast, I started my first idea was talk to people who are working in the world of sanitation. And I thought, well, there's so many other people doing great stuff in terms of being change makers. And then Kathy was one of the people I spoke with, because Kathy is obviously a change maker extraordinaire. I spoke with Peter Singer, philosopher down in Tasmania, who a lot of people don't like, but gee, he's interesting. I've spoken with a lot of other people in the world of sanitation as well. I spoke with Jill Hicks just a couple of weeks ago, a young woman who lost both her legs in the London bombing back in 2005, and is now doing work with young radicals. And so I guess I'm just looking for people who've got a story to tell that really does involve that really has something to do with making the world clearly better for people who might otherwise fall by the wayside.
I mean, just from my background, of course, I'm going to fixate on the singer there for a second, but I mean, he's somebody who has fairly strong views about where aid money or development money should be directed, and what the best uses of that are, which are not always the obvious ones or the ones that people tend to gravitate to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Peter Singer had the thing that drew me to him was his book called The Most Good You Can Do, and it struck a really positive chord with me. Just the realization that sometimes people spend an awful lot of money to change a life, and his book was saying, forget changing a life. What about change 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million, 10 million? Why not change every life? And some of his approaches maybe it's too black and white, but his aim is to make people think. I know there was a time I spoke at a Rotary Club in New Jersey some years ago at 4 o'clock in the morning on Zoom, and these are the things you do when your life's in the toilet. and, so I was talking to them, and they told me their biggest project was they would give $20,000 per year to 10 kids from New Jersey, so $200,000 a year as a scholarship to help cover part of their first year's studies at an Ivy League university. That's $200,000 a year. And I looked at it. I said, if you gave me that $200,000, and I got a bit smart getting some matching grants from the Rotary Foundation and some other people involved, whatever, I could help 50,000 kids get access to toilets. 10 kids, 50,000 kids. I said, yeah. But what if one of the 10 is the next Einstein? I said, yeah, what if one of the 50,000 is the next Einstein? And I mean, look, I guess to be honest, there's not many Einsteins coming out of slums in India, but there are some smart people out there. And maybe we're not only looking for Einsteins, maybe we're just looking for people who will have a better life because of our intervention. And to me, in general, if I can help 50,000 rather than 10, I probably prefer to help the 50,000. But of course, it's overly simplistic because there are so many cases where helping a small number has a broader impact beyond the small number. Kathy's work is a fantastic example of that helping even one person has a broader impact on others around them.
Margot's just asked what your thoughts are on the Who Gives a Crap initiative.
Oh, fantastic. Simon's story, the founder, he needed $50,000 to get the business started and he didn't have the money. So he sat on a toilet in front of a webcam for 50 hours and raised $50,000. And they just gave $5 million recently to WaterAid and a couple of other organizations. And they're an amazing organization. Simon is in my headlights for a podcast talk. I know him reasonably well. I used to be, at one stage, I was the CEO of a co-working space in Melbourne, and Who Gives a Crap were working out of there. I'll be talking to him before the end of the year, I'm sure.
So what's next in terms of your projects? You mentioned Ethiopia. So what sort of things are coming up?
So far, and since starting this work, which actually our first toilets were open in March 2015. We opened 15 toilets in one school. And since then, and that helped 500 kids. Since then, we've reached about 100,000 kids, mainly in India, a little bit through direct or indirect intervention in Lebanon and in East Timor and Cambodia and the Solomon Islands and Guatemala and in Ethiopia now. The project in Ethiopia is a broader community-focused project which covers some schools in some villages, but actually extends to the rest of the village as well. That's going to be about 30,000 people reached through that. And that's using a methodology we haven't tried before because it's a methodology that seems to be culturally acceptable in Ethiopia. It's called community-led total sanitation, where basically we seed it, but the community takes over and obviously get guidance and whatever when needed. But the belief is that, and I guess it kind of, from what I was saying before, it makes sense that if the community wants it badly enough and they're given the power to make it happen, it's more likely to last. So it's a trial, but it's an important trial.
Seems like that's a lesson that comes through in a lot of projects like this. I mean, I know there's been similar discussions around things like wind farms and so on, that, if you get that community buy-in right up front, then you're much more likely to have a successful project because you don't have those kinds of resentments going on, or people feeling outside of it.
Yeah, But look, I guess in answer to your question, what's next? I've been thinking about that since day one. And when I first started it, my aim was to put 15 toilets in a school. And then I'd feel better and I could go back to my old life. And that never happened. And that Rotary Club I spoke at, who were spending $200,000 on scholarships, after I'd spoken there, they cut the scholarship fund in half and put the other half into humanitarian projects, including a small sanitation project in Guatemala, actually. And about 6 months later, I had a call from the guy at that Rotary Club who invited me to speak there, saying, I needed to tell you something. We took heart to what you said, and we've done a small sanitation project in Guatemala, but that's not what I'm calling you about. What I'm calling you about is about a month ago, I was sitting on a plane flying across the US on business, and it turned out I was sitting next to a Rotarian from California. Told him my story and told him your story, and he said, I love it so much that he went back to his club and they decided to do a small sanitation project in a school in Honduras. This ripple effect. I've got no idea how many people have been truly affected by what we've done. All I know is those two, but I know of others. I know of a city council in India that said, we like your work so much, but we're not content with the 19 schools you worked in. We're going to do the same in 350 schools. This flow-on effect is what we're really looking for. And I actually wrote an article, which I put on LinkedIn last year. And my title was, it's easy to help 10 million people if you know that helping a million's a given. And I guess helping a million's easy if you know that helping 100,000 is a given. Helping 100,000 is easy if you know that helping 10,000 is a given. So it's that scalability through belief in your story and in others to want to grab onto it and do more of the same. My aim is for us to eventually be forgotten in the line of expansion that grows from where we started. And I'm sure there are people out there who have put toilets into schools or communities that came from talking to someone who talked to someone who talked to someone who had something to do with us, who have no idea who we are, and that's great. That's that's what I'm looking for. The reality is, if you don't care who gets the credit, you can do so much more. And I don't care who gets the credit; it's irrelevant. But I do want you to read my book.
Yeah. And listen to the podcast. Wonderful. Well, Mark, thank you. I think you do deserve credit, even if you don't want to take it yourself, for really having an astonishing impact. And the numbers that you're describing are just, hard to get your head around. And that in itself is an impressive thing. And just before we finish up tonight, I will say too, if you've enjoyed Impact Chat this evening, can we encourage you to donate to Impact's Court Childcare project, which is, again, a really fantastic little project that sort of identifies a non-obvious need that, if you fix it, makes a really systemic difference, and that makes a big sort of impact on the lives of women dealing with violence in the home. So,
Patrick,
Mark,
there was an article in the paper about this today, in the news today, about exactly this issue, that there's been a massive increase in waiting time in the family courts. The judges aren't keeping up. The judges are losing their minds with the amount of work, and the impact on the children and their mothers in particular is frightening.
Yeah. So yeah, you'll find some information on the website. I'm sure Kathy will say something shortly about that. But Mark, thank you very much indeed. It's been really fascinating to talk to you, and I've certainly enjoyed it. I'm sure everyone else has. Can I ask everyone to give a slightly constrained due to the Zoom format virtual round of applause to Mark Balla for talking to us this evening?
Cool. You can get it at thesmallestroom.info, which is where you also find my podcast with Kathy, among others. Thesmallestroom.info. Even if you don't buy the book, listen to some of the chats, particularly the one with Kathy.
Thanks very much. Kathy, back to you.
Thanks so much. You're muted, Kathy.
Wow, I told you this was an interesting man to listen to, and Mark, you didn't disappoint. Listen, before I do my thank you, I've got a question for you. You mentioned you did linguistics. Where and when?
La Trobe University. I finished my honours in 1987, but it was a long winding road. I started off doing biological sciences in 1981,
Wow, you're still a baby.
I decided I didn't like genetics, I preferred linguistics. So.
I was in the first linguistics honours class at Monash University several years earlier than that. And I knew that you and I have many areas in our lives that cross over and meld, but I didn't know that one. So, and for people who don't know, linguistics doesn't mean we speak many languages. It's the science of language, and it's fascinating, isn't it, Mark?
Yeah, although I do speak German, Spanish and Portuguese, and my French is kind of okay. But...
Well, I used to speak a few languages too, but, you know, I'm senior and I blame it on that. Speaking of senior, many of you would have noticed that our treasurer, Alan Samuel, who's here, changed his background from Impact to Rotary because he's also an absolute Rotary fiend. And Mark, were you up at 6 a.m. with Alan to listen to the talk with...
that talk this morning was only for not Rotary, it was executive directors from synagogues.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
Well, it wasn't a Rotary connection.
Okay. All right. Well, I thought it might have been, but that's so, okay. So you didn't have to sleep in, you could sleep in a little bit.
No,
but again,
I had my own Rotary meeting at 7 this morning as well.
You had at 7. Okay. Well, Alan has come up with a term, and since he had to be up at 6, he wasn't sure he'd make it tonight. So I asked him if he could have several scans. And a scan is a senior citizen afternoon nap. It's much nicer than a nana nap. Okay, Mark, it's been a real honour to have you. And Patrick, thank you so much for conducting this conversation. You brought out so many different interesting things too. And a lot of the things melded so nicely with what you do, with how we do it and how we think at Impact too, about in community engagement. Get the people to come along with you on the journey, to understand what the needs are and to come along with you. That you can make a dramatic change in a very short period of time. You talked about, gave a case study where in 3 days there was a dramatic change. And we often say at Impact, it doesn't take much to make a big impact. I was really interested when you were talking about the girls and the young female teachers not wanting to drink water. And it reminded me of a friend of mine when they travel in the third world country. Every time they walk past a hotel, my friend says to her husband, "You're hungry, aren't you?" And he has to go and eat so that she can go to the loo. The other thing I wanted to say was about your book, The Toilet Warrior, and thank you for telling us where you can get it. Now, where can people donate?
operationtoilets.org.au.
And so my challenge to everybody is, yes, of course I want you to donate to Impact, but if you're in a position to make any donation tonight, how about you split it 50-50? Because that would be really, really nice to help further Mark's work, which is really, really important, and to further our work, which is also really, really important. The other point I wanted to make, with the help of Rotary, we've nearly eradicated polio around the world. I think it's only in 1 or 2 countries now.
Afghanistan and Pakistan left. In fact, Africa was declared polio-free just a few days ago.
That's right. I had read that. And that's an amazing achievement. If you guys can achieve that, we can get toilets in all the schools, in all the areas that we need to. I know it's going to happen. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, Pat. It was amazing having you both here. Maybe I can convince you both to reverse the roles in maybe next year, because Pat's got some interesting stories to tell too. In a fortnight, so 2 weeks from today, same time, same place, we'll be in conversation with Lydia Thorpe. Now, Lydia is a Gunai and Gunditjmara mother and grandmother, and she lives on Wandjara country. She's a survivor of terrible domestic abuse. She became bankrupt as a result of it. And then she became the first Aboriginal woman to sit in Victorian Parliament. And very soon she'll become Victoria's first Aboriginal senator in federal Parliament. So